Drones and shadows. Corporal Kade froze. His suit detected the hum of drone engines before his ears did and alerted him to the danger. He already had a preset infrared profile prepared to deal with this recurring problem. In a few seconds, he would appear as no more than an errant garbage can to IR sensors. "You are trash," he repeated to himself like a mantra, holding still with all his willpower as the enemy drone swarm flew overhead. He would blend in perfectly with his surroundings. This city was a giant open-air landfill anyway. After a few moments, and with reasonable confidence they hadn't noticed him, he continued on through the ruins. This section of the city had been hit hard by the recent fighting. His own side's drones hadn't been able to make it this far in due to some unusually heavy jamming. He would occasionally encounter one with its emergency light winking red in the smoke and haze of the battlefield. Taking a moment to survey the situation, he looked into the distance. The spine loomed, though many miles away. Its fractured bulk was the perfect backdrop to the current situation. Big, expensive, and hopelessly broken. Years ago it had been called a spire, the largest megastructure ever conceived by humanity, an orbital elevator meant to usher in the next phase of human expansion into space. But just before it was completed, an asteroid or some other space debris had hit near the top of the spire. It had stripped away the cladding to reveal the magnetic rails and ribbed internal structure, tall and bone white. Kade sighed to himself and hefted his pulse rifle, scanning the rest of the horizon, trying to get his bearings after his last dash to the relative safety of yet another abandoned building. He had to get to that drone control center. His mission was to destroy it. Even orbital scans hadn't been able to reveal its location. There were too many ways for drones to hide, and the jamming was interfering with all of their sensors and recon drones. Luckily, or maybe not, the heavy exosuit had enough shielding, at least at the moment, to withstand the majority of the problems. But his comms were nothing but static, and the isolation was definitely starting to get to him. It had been 2 days since the bad drop. They'd gotten ambushed, mostly human combatants, but they were hit mid-flight and were well within the blackout zone, unable to get any call for help. He had a job to do, not just for the sake of his fallen squad, but because he wouldn't survive to be exfiltrated without clearing the jamming field. A gust of wind blew through the dusty carcasses of the surrounding buildings, causing them to emit an almost melodious whistling sound. It made him shiver. Even in his isolated state, he'd have preferred the complete silence or the hum of drone copters to that. He rounded a corner and knelt to check his map. Still on track for the approximate location. The drones were patrolling a general center point, which had already been hit several times with hypersonic missiles, but to no avail. Most of the drones also had primitive microwave shielding foil tape over the electronics. Many of the frames were even constructed from wood to save money and weight. This had made them very difficult to destroy in mass, and there just weren't enough resources to throw at the problem these days without deploying a massive amount of material to fight the drones one-on-one. It was actually more cost-effective to send humans to do it. Lucky him. Ducking into an empty storefront, he decided to record his progress so far. It felt a lot like sending a message in a bottle at this point, unsure as he was that anyone would ever find his combat log. He took a sip of his dwindling water and continued on. It had started to get near dusk, the haze of dust blending into a haze of shade and shadows. He came to an abandoned intersection. Eerily quiet, he hesitated. It was a lot of open space to clear. 4 lanes stretched ahead without anything, not even an abandoned car. Not wanting to spend too much time, he sprinted across the distance, his power armor's legs propelling him in a fraction of the time it would take without them. Too bad his power was running low. He would have loved to rush in, guns blazing, and right back out again. He cleared the distance and jumped over a broken barricade, then hunkered down. At the far end of the other street was a formation of drones headed in the other direction. He hoped they hadn't detected him. But one of the drones in the rear of the formation malfunctioned, wavering drunkenly from side to side as it tried to remain in sync with the others. At last, with a final spark and flutter, it spun out of the sky some 40 feet away and came to rest too near Kade. Its camera must have crossed over him in its descent. He waited in silence for only a split second before leaping back over the barrier. He'd been seen. No sooner had he cleared the top of the barricade than he heard shots ring out from the drone formation. Some of the drones weren't the typical self-detonating type and had been equipped with small arms. He used the telescoping stalk on his shoulder-mounted microwave emitter to send a pulse over the barricade. Most of the drones had that silver tape on them, but a few might go down. His armor detected the sound of the remaining drones as they positioned themselves for the attack. They had decent coordination software and would attempt to maneuver into optimal positions before rushing him in a final explosive collision. He wouldn't give them the time, especially since they hadn't been programmed to account for his suit's enhanced capabilities. Even if they had, he could almost move as fast as them, albeit only in short bursts. Rounding the edge of the barricade, he saw the first one. He fired off a short burst, and it flared into a fireball. Incendiary charge. That wasn't very nice of them, but inexpensive and potentially deadly. Small arms fire pinged off his rear armor as one of the long-range drones cleared the concrete shield. Pivoting fluidly, he fired another burst, and the drone shattered into wood and metal fragments. Running in the direction of the downed unit, he left the cover of the barricade and ran to the nearest building. There was an explosion behind him as several of the remaining drones destroyed his former refuge, the heat and pressure knocking him off his feet and into a tumble. Rolling with the explosion, he got to his feet and leapt the 12 feet or so into a second-story window. Most of the glass had already been shattered, so he glided in through the opening and rolled to a stop, lying down and facing the fresh entrance, his rifle ready. A drone flared, spraying what smelled like burning gasoline all over the interior of the room. The space felt like it was intended to be an open floor-plan office building, but it was never occupied, stacks of unused cubicle walls shielding him from most of the splashes. He backed out the door into a long, empty hallway, weapon at the ready. Continuing to cover for another possible attack, he glanced around briefly. There were a number of doors to the interior side of the building, so he tried the first one. It was locked. Putting some power into it, he rammed the door with his shoulder, and it burst off its hinges and clattered to the ground. Too much force. And too much noise. He took a moment to catch his breath and check his map. This was within the probable radius of the control center. These drones only lasted for a few hours before needing to recharge and rearm. If he could find that control center and take it out, all he would need to do was wait for the swarm's batteries to run out, and he could be extracted. Another strike wasn't authorized. The Orbital Launch Authority, or OLA, had already considered this mission too costly as it was, and they didn't want any more collateral damage. An irony lost on no one, given the current state of the entire Spire project. He knew he couldn't stay here long. The smell of smoke was getting stronger, and with the mess he had made just a few minutes earlier, he knew there would be other swarms on the way, if not actual human combatants. A power armor trooper was formidable on their own, but he was alone after all and would tire eventually. The jamming meant that the drones couldn't transmit any data, but if the patrol didn't return, they would send additional resources to investigate, and he didn't want to be here when that happened. Returning to the long hallway, he carefully poked his head into every exterior-facing room until he found one with unshattered glass by the street farthest from where the last fight had occurred. Entering the room, he looked out onto the street below. Something must have happened here several years ago. There were a couple of abandoned OLA patrol MRAPs burned out. Unfortunate for them, but cover for him. He descended a staircase to the bottom floor and found a street exit near the MRAPs. Scanning the sky, he ran for the first vehicle. He had just made it into the door when another drone patrol came around the building's corner. He lay down as best he could in his somewhat bulky armor and engaged his active IR camouflage again. The drones progressed down the street slowly, being thorough in their search patterns. They'd arrived quickly. It had only been 10 minutes or so since he'd destroyed the other cluster. That could be an indication that he was close to the control center. He wasn't sure if that was true, but hoped for the best anyway. The sensor sweeps of the enemy were displayed on his helmet's HUD, shifting lazily down the street, occasionally stopping at an object of interest for closer inspection. He tensed and lowered his head, readying his weapons for a possible attack. A 3-unit group hovered over his MRAP for a moment, then he watched as they separated to check the abandoned vehicles. With careful precision, one of the drones came down from above the roof of the vehicle and slipped inside the armored frame. He lay on his back in the rear of the unit, under a bank of folding chairs for soldiers. It had largely been stripped of anything of value, only a few scraps of padding remained on the chairs, and the plastic and metal frames were bent. Again, he tried to visualize himself as garbage. If the drone had a LiDAR sensor, it would easily detect his humanoid contours and attack. His armor was tough, but had seen a lot of action already and couldn't take a direct hit from a medium-sized charge at this range. He held his breath as the sensor swept over his prone form. He heard the rush of air flowing from the drone's fans. He could almost feel it moving his hair, although he knew that was impossible with his fully sealed helmet. He caught brief flashes as it hovered above him, illuminated by the flickering streetlights. He heard the same melodic whistling sound that had haunted him on and off all day. In time, the drone floated out of the door and rejoined its larger formation. Cautiously, he sat up and watched as the enemy rounded the corner and went down another roadway. He shouldered his rifle as he exited the vehicle and decided to head in the direction the drones had come from. That would be the most likely origin of the drone control center. There was a very large apartment complex in that direction that was known to be occupied by squatters. It wasn't the epicenter of the drone patrols, and since it was known to be inhabited by civilians, it hadn't been struck by any missiles. It's not that the OLA was especially queasy about the human costs of war, but there was only so much bad publicity they were willing to take with the project, in as bad a shape as it was already. Swiftly and quietly he proceeded to his destination. There would need to be a large power source to operate overlapping drone patrols and to run multiple jamming nodes that covered an area this large. It was likely that the inhabitants of the area had pulled miles of electrical cables and run them underground to power the whole setup, with multiple subterranean entrances so the drones couldn't be tracked to a single location. He inspected the light posts. This one was not functioning. Its maintenance panel was opened, and the interior was hollow. Hardly surprising, though. But there was at least some power to this area, even if it was intermittent. There were solar arrays on almost every rooftop, but they would need extensive batteries to operate overnight. It would have been nice if they could have just cut the power to this section of the city and waited them out. Continuing on, he came to an underground parking entrance at the base of the apartment complex. It sloped off the main road, out of the flickering light and into steady darkness. As carefully as he could, he approached the tiny hut that in a functioning city should have been occupied by an automaton staff member. It was filled only with dirty blankets and cardboard. Someone's home. Well, it was cozy at least, but it appeared to be abandoned, likely due to the recent violence. He stepped carefully around the broken gate and into the parking garage. Car recharging stations were pulled and gutted, leaving holes in the concrete where they were meant to be. They had been very efficiently removed and recycled, no doubt. Many of the components were likely used to build the drones and their supporting infrastructure. Across the parking lot were the stairs that led up into the main part of the building. As he continued on, he heard the familiar whistling sound again. He froze. How was that possible? He was inside the building now, and it sounded so close. Carefully peering around a corner, he saw dark shapes hunched over an enemy drone. There was a faint glow illuminating them from behind. At first, he thought it was a group of rebels doing drone repairs, but the silhouettes were all wrong. Their heads had very sharp, elongated points, and an array of what looked like cameras. Were these humanoid drones? They seemed far too costly to be doing simple drone repairs in a place like this. The whistling began again. Slightly discordant and lilting, the sound gradually synchronized and intensified. Just as it was beginning to crest, it abruptly stopped, and so did the figures. What he supposed were their heads turned and looked directly at him. They weren't drones, couldn't be. With lightning-swift motion, they stood and charged him. He let out a full burst from his pulse rifle, the flashes revealing a blaze of images as they approached. They must have had weapons of some kind because he felt something impact his leg, and it almost took him down. Bullets or something sliced the air over his head. He fired a grenade from his rifle at the feet of the nearest one and ducked back around a corner. It detonated, and he was glad for the automatic hearing protection in his helmet. He reloaded and went back around the corner, determined to press the attack. It looked like the grenade did the trick, however, as there was no motion on any of his detectors. Stooping down, he inspected the nearest creature. It was vaguely insectoid. It had a large, pointed, triangular head with numerous black orbs studded along the corners. Its body was also triangular with an arm-like appendage on each side and 3 legs as well. It appeared to have been carrying a weapon of some kind similar to a rifle. That reminded him he had been hit in the leg, so he looked down to inspect the damage. Several black spikes were stuck in his right shin guard. A large, prominent one had pierced his armor, but at an angle, so it hadn't gone through his leg. That would have definitely complicated the mission. Movement caught his attention. The creature was shot to bits, but it slowly stirred. It lay in a pool of thick white liquid very similar in appearance to school glue and faintly luminous. Chunks of its black shell were mixed among the fluids. How could this thing still be moving, even slightly? It was far too damaged to be any threat, but it seemed to refuse to die. The broken edges of its armored exterior frayed and appeared fibrous. Some of the outermost edges were smoldering, red embers almost ready to light into a fire. Some of the larger threads were burning lightly, tracing along the line of the fiber, traveling in a wavy, swirling pattern that was almost beautiful. It was difficult to believe what he was seeing, but he backed away after he was sure that he had captured enough footage for analysis. Going over to the drone, passing other downed creatures, he examined what they had been doing. They hadn't been repairing the drone, but disassembling it, and they were very particular about it. It didn't look like they needed any tools, and every tiny screw had been removed from half of the unit. Each one was laid out on the concrete in a perfect grid-like pattern, along with the other parts. The silver foil tape had been removed and meticulously folded over on itself and set aside. I hope they don't treat people the same way, he thought to himself. But he already felt like that hope was in vain. How many of them were there? He'd been hearing that whistling noise for some time, but hadn't seen one until now. He'd been alone for several days, cut off from everyone, with no communication. Was the unease he had felt more than just his isolation? A growing sense of dread came over him. He was surrounded, and he didn't even know by what or how many. Were they responsible for the jamming? It would have taken an incredible amount of power to generate a field this dense. Did they generate it themselves, or was there some technological device they were employing? So many questions and no way to answer them as a single man alone in a vast ruined city. He gathered his wits and returned to the stairway, needing to continue his search for the drone control center. Although the exterior of the building looked to be in good repair, the interior had seen better days. A large section of stairs had given way, and he had to jump, chunks of concrete breaking loose from the edge to crash loudly below. He didn't know what kind of hearing those things had, but if they could, they'd notice that for sure, if the grenade hadn't already alerted them to his presence. Above his head was a rather large hole in the ceiling that led all the way to what looked like the top floor. Cables had ran along the edge of the garage, up the wall and through the hole. This should lead to the control center then. There were signs of habitation, but no people, no whistlers, as he'd taken to calling them, and no drone control center. Plus, all of the rooms and hallways had started looking the same a long time ago. Just as he was about to take a short break to recharge, He opened one last door on the 12th floor and almost gagged. This is what had happened to all of the people. The Whistlers had given the same treatment to the building's residents. Dissection, but in the most precise and meticulous way possible. This large apartment now hosted several hundred people's remains. Not that he stayed to count them all. Bones were neatly stacked by type, organs as well. Every pot and pan held blood. For such a grisly task, the apartment was surprisingly clean. Not clean enough to get their security deposit back, but still. With significant effort, he closed the door and decided to continue to the next floor, eager to put that sight behind him. He decided to start with the maintenance section. Near the top of the building, there should be a mechanical room of some kind. Off the main stairway that led to the roof was a door marked for maintenance staff only. It barely hung on its hinges. What looked like claw marks had scratched the doorknob away. A hole had been cut in the bottom of the door, and a large bundle of electrical cables went in. If there was a drone control center in the building, it had to be here. And if there were any more Whistlers, as he suspected there must be, they would be here as well. Despite the hum from the completely unsafe power cables, none of the lights were on. In fact, all of the light bars had been destroyed. The hum of the power cables intensified as more cables came up through holes in the floor. They must have run the additional cables up the air vents, and there was a huge hole through the center of the building all the way to the parking garage. Some of the cables ran upward, and he assumed they went to the roof to power some other device up there. He turned a corner and stepped into a pool of some sort of commercial chemical. Around a large drum that must have been 100 gallons was a dozen or more of the creatures. They used their pointy fingers to puncture the side of the plastic barrel and were lapping up the bright blue fluid. They were whistling up a storm. He was glad they were more excited about drinking industrial chemicals than what came in people, even though he knew that wouldn't save him. They hadn't seemed to notice him, engrossed as they were with getting drunk off whatever it was they had found. He chambered his last grenade, took aim at the center of the flock of creatures, and pulled the trigger. The offensive grenade blew the center Whistler almost in half and scattered the rest. Most of them didn't seem to have their weapons on them, and so he opened fire on the rest. The rounds cracked through their shells easily enough, but the creatures wouldn't go down. He reloaded and started backing up, hosing them down with fire the whole time. Not a single other monster fell after that first one. And now they were starting to regain their heads, coming towards him in a rush. He fired again, slowing but not crippling any of them. How many bullets would it take? Whenever it took a serious amount of damage, they would just swivel their heads and bodies around to a new fresh section and continue on. They must not have their brains in their heads, because he put about 20 rounds in one, but it just turned its head to present the most functional eyes and kept coming. He was backing up the stairs to the roof now. Shouldering the door open, he went out. There were a number of large commercial AC units and other equipment he didn't recognize. There was something that looked like a control antenna with cables from the floor below running to it. The jamming from the bugs made it useless, but it was for sure the control array. The drones had been running on their last orders, unable to receive new ones. One of the creatures poked its long, pointed face around the door behind him. He gave it a few rounds, but it didn't even duck its head back. If only he had a way to take out the top couple of floors of this building. He'd have to hit the drone equipment and all of the Whistlers at once. There was a sound behind him. More Whistlers had been on the roof and were now advancing toward him from several directions. He was surrounded and almost out of ammunition. There was really only one idea he had left. He went into his IR system and turned it to maximum, then ran to the nearest edge of the building that was free of enemies. He started flailing his arms and yelling. Several large drone swarms were immediately on alert, their motors winding up to attack him. The Whistler seemed confused as he rushed back into their midst, emptying his last magazine and pulling out his combat knife. He buried it in the triangular head of one of the creatures and punched another, its head exploding with a satisfying squelch. One of them managed to grab his ankle and pull him to the ground, but it was already too late for them. Drones were pouring over the lip of the building and crashing into the whistlers in their attempt to get to him. Pops and explosions, incendiaries, and small-caliber rounds rained down on them. As one final act, he switched his heat profile to garbage and was still struggling as the crackling explosions came closer. There must have been hundreds of them. Part of the roof gave way. He fell into darkness.